There was a female who was found on the side of a roadway. This particular person was found off of Pacheco Pass in unincorporated Gilroy. Pacheco Pass is also known as California State Route 152.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. The Happy Face Killer's unknown victim, Patricia Skipple, Part 1 of 2. Welcome back to the Murder Police Podcast. I am Wendy.
And I'm David.
Well, David, why don't you share with our listeners what this episode is about?
Another deep dive into a murder case. We're going to talk about the well-known Happy Face Killer in California and the fact that he had a victim that nobody knew who it was for decades. You know, we always hear about those cases where you have no body and we make a prosecution. This was maybe just as tragic in the idea that they have a body, they have a suspect, they convict him, they put him in prison. But it took decades to identify, and we're going to take the listeners to what it's like to talk to Sergeant Kat Catalino with the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office about how much work goes in to identifying somebody that we don't know.
You know, ironically, as you and, well, everyone know, I'm such a true crime enthusiast, and they had just put on Hulu, not long before we did this, episodes on the Happy Face Killer, and at that time, I didn't know we were going to be bringing this on, but I did go back and watch that. And, you know, at this time when this aired, they had not released who Patricia Skipple was. So it was neat doing the podcast and then going back and watching it again and knowing that the officers talked about unknown victims that he didn't release, or maybe he didn't know their names, but knowing that we knew part of that puzzle, thanks to Kat sharing this with us.
Exactly. I think that's why I was excited. We got to meet the lead detective that was part of a large team response for the last few decades. And so let's let the listeners hear how much work goes in the background for something that we just see as a news headline one day.
All right. Awesome. Well, let's get into it. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. Today we are talking with Kat with Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, and we are going to be discussing the 1993 murder of Patricia Skipple, also known as Patsy.
Kat, go ahead and let us and the audience know exactly who you are, aside from Kat, and where you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'm Shannon Catalano. I'm currently a detective sergeant with the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. I am assigned to oversee the human trafficking unit and to homicide. As a collateral duty, I also am a member of our crime scene investigators team. I work CSI as well.
Gotcha. How long have you been in law enforcement, Kat?
I started with the sheriff's office about 14 years ago. It will be 15 years coming up this September. And aside from working at the sheriff's office, I married my best friend, Steven Catalano, about 14 years ago as well. Thankfully, he does not work in this field. He works in something totally different. He's a chef. But we met back when I was in graduate school at Loyola University in Chicago. And we have 3 kids. So Jackson is our oldest, and Tyler's our middle, and Wyatt is our youngest. Jackson likes to play chess. Tyler's a dancer. She just won the Grand National Champion titleship this year. And my little one's starting his first season of football, so he's really excited about that. We're busy.
Needless to say, I was going to say, you definitely stay busy.
Stay busy. And at least, hey, you've got somebody to cook dinner for you, so that's always a bonus.
All the time. That's true. Anything you want, he can make it. So that's always great.
Nice. What got you interested in law enforcement?
Well, I think that one of the things that I find to be really rewarding about law enforcement in general is that we are able to do something small every day, and it's something different every day. And ultimately, those little small actions can end up having a really big impact on other people's lives. And there's not a lot of professions that offer that opportunity time and time again. And I feel like that is the reason why I wanted to get into law enforcement. I feel like that's the way I like to live my life, just doing small things that have a positive effect for other people. This job allows me to do that over and over again. every day the job gives back tenfold what you put in.
Agreed. And I love the analogy with the small things, because a lot of people that get interested from watching maybe Cops or one of the live police shows is I don't think they understand that you're going to move the world maybe in tiny ways instead of giant ones.
Definitely.
And I think it makes I think you're a healthier cop if you come on board knowing that it's going to be small increments instead of life-saving things every day, because otherwise it's kind of boring, right? And
yeah.
Well, Kat, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this case is all about? As I said, it's from 1993. So why don't you dig in a little deeper and give us some back history on it?
Sure. To me, this case, and I think to our agency as a whole, that this case is really all about the pursuit of pursuing and just really being persistent in order to give a family answers about what happened to their loved one. For this case, we didn't know as we were investigating it who this person was, who this woman was, but we knew she was someone's daughter. And we were really interested in trying to figure out who this victim was and ultimately wanted to give her name back. For this case, it was all about not settling for her to forever be called Jane Doe.
Well, let me rewind a little and tell our listeners, because I'm sure if I'm thinking this, they likely are thinking the same. Tell us a little history on where she was found, how she was found. Did someone stumble upon her? What made her become this unknown Jane Doe?
Yeah, so this case happened back in 1993. There was a female who was found on the side of a roadway. At that time, I would have been about 10 years old. So it's pretty astonishing to think about, the time difference. And this particular person was found off of Pacheco Pass in unincorporated Gilroy. And Pacheco Pass is also known as California State Route 152. I actually grew up in Gilroy, in that town where she was found. And a person who was driving truck of their own who stopped on the side of the roadway discovered this person back in June of 1993 on June 3rd. At the time, she was clad in blue clothing. Later, when I started working on this case, that's how I came to call this case with my agency, Blue Pacheco.
Hey, Murder Police Podcast fans. The Murder Police Podcast now has its own merch and swag store. Go to themurderpolicepodcast.com and click the Murder Police merch store button now.
do you have any idea what happened with the case prior to you getting hold of it? And then, of course, we'd like to know how you got involved. But do you have any idea what efforts were made or how time passed in all that time before you got hold of it?
This was a case where the sheriff's office never stopped pursuing this case. It was handed from detective after detective after detective, even as time passed by, to where nobody was stopping their efforts to try to figure out who this person was. The history of this case is many sketch artist renditions being completed and shown to people throughout several law enforcement agencies and members of the community. It included several detectives speaking with the public and with media outlets to try to raise awareness for this case. And ultimately, this case had 26 years of work put into it before I ever started working on the case. I was only able to be successful in this case because of all the hard work of the detectives, the civilians, the patrol officers, and death investigators, and everybody else that came before me. Ultimately, this case is unique because in 1994, there was kind of a break in the case. So I can talk about that too.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, how encouraging to the family to know that despite being passed on from detective to detective, that it still had all that focus, because that's a huge thing for victims' families. The more time goes on, the more hopeless I think things get. We're actually good friends with somebody, I believe, from a 2-year-old murder, and our, 5th or 6th detective now, I believe?
Seventh.
Seventh, yeah, because Because of the turnover in law enforcement plays a big role in that right now in the current era we're in. But what a fantastic message of hope for people that are out there listening is that just because we don't hear anything doesn't mean there's not efforts going on.
When she was found, when this victim was found, was it obvious what the method of death was? Did it look like she had been hit by a car? She had been shot? She had been... What was the perceived method of death at that time? And secondly, was there any missing persons filed? Were people looking? Did she match a missing Jane Doe? Or was it just truly nothing was known about her until this break in this case?
So it wasn't apparent how she died when she was found. There were several persons of interest who detectives tried to compare who we had found with other missing persons. But ultimately, all of those leads led to no identifications. So there weren't any missing persons who ended up being thought to be our Jane Doe. Although the detectives at the time looked at several potential missing persons to see if they were a fit, and they were not.
And I'd have to add, too, back then that record-keeping databases, the things we take for granted these days, just didn't exist. And methods of communication were not very sophisticated at all, and that always made that difficult back in the when she was found, too.
So in 94, you had a slight break. What was that?
We didn't know it at the time. Our agency didn't know it for sure at the time, but back in 1994, an Oregon newspaper ended up running a 5-part series called The Happy Face Serial Killer. And an anonymous letter writer claimed to have committed 5 murders throughout the West, and 4 of those 5 cases were unsolved. And the case that was quote unquote solved was later determined to have 2 wrongfully convicted persons charged with one of the homicides. And this happy face serial killer signed his anonymous letters with a happy face symbol, which is how he was dubbed the name Happy Face Serial Killer. It was later determined that that person was an individual by the name of Keith Hunter Jesperson, and that was kind of the beginning of determining who was responsible for the homicide of our Jane Doe.
Tell us more. How did it evolve from there?
So there were some things that you mentioned previously about the communications being different back then versus now in 2022. Back then, there was a lot of communication between that newspaper and between the law enforcement agencies that these anonymous letters had associations with. And ultimately, there were some things that were disclosed that were unique to the case that were not available to the public. Down the road, where Jesperson wrote a letter to our district attorney, eventually describing how he murdered our Jane Doe, and again, providing those unique details about the killing that weren't available to the public. And ultimately, he ended up being charged in her death. So that's another thing that's really unique about this case, is that we have a conviction. And it was several years later that that conviction occurred. He wasn't convicted of homicide until July 27th, back in 2007. After that conviction, he still was not able to disclose the name of our Jane Doe, and she remained a Jane Doe.
That's got to be kind of frustrating. On the one side, you get a conviction, but on the other side, like we'd started out with, you have a family somewhere that has no idea who this is or what their fate was.
When I got assigned to the Detective Bureau, that was in 2015 when I first started. And I started kind of as a general detective, and I worked in a general crimes assignment, but I did have a unique opportunity to work under another sergeant, Rick Alanis, and he was my supervisor who kind of schooled me up on cold cases and how to work cold cases initially. He really unraveled the case of Arliss Perry, who was killed at the Stanford Memorial Church back in the 70s. And that unique opportunity kind of prepared me for this case. And after working with him and in general crimes, I got moved up north to the major crimes unit eventually and the homicide unit. And while I was working CSI, I also had another unique opportunity to work with Sergeant Noe Cortez, who also resolved and untangled the case of Leslie Perloff, which was another homicide, which was done by a serial killer of a Stanford graduate. So both of those two cases really prepared me for when I was fortunate to be given the opportunity to work cold case. And when I was reviewing this cold case in particular, that really bothered me that there was a conviction of this prolific serial killer, and we still didn't have the name of the person who he actually killed. And just in my heart, I felt like we had to do everything possible to just exhaust every option to really determine who Blue Pacheco was. And we couldn't give up or stop until we did. And I feel there's a lot of detectives that came before me that felt that exact same way.
I'm sure there's probably several in retirement that probably think of it often. Some of them just stick with you, I think. They just stick with you. Let me just real quick, because you talked about being fortunate enough to go to cold case, which I'm jealous. I always said that if I was going to go back one day, which is not likely, but if I was, it would be to maybe work cold cases with some of the people I used to work with in the old days. Are there any of the basic premises about cold case investigation that stand out to you that might be different than picking up a regular case that's just happened?
Definitely. I think cold cases are unique because people call them cold cases, but I don't like to think of them as cold cases. I like to think of them as open cases because a lot of times the information that you need are living in the files and the evidence that you have. And that's not always, but sometimes. And things that are different when you're working these open cases are that somebody, if you just think about who you were as a human, 30 years ago versus now, you might be a completely different person. And the willingness or the cooperativeness of some of the people who were involved in investigations back when a case initially occurred might have been different than it is now. So all of these open cases are ones that are true opportunities to still be pursued differently. And if you do get the opportunity to work these cases, the great part is that you're a fresh new set of eyes. You're looking at something that people have looked at for a long period of time, and you have an opportunity to try to bring something, new to the table, or maybe technology now that didn't exist back when the case initially occurred. To me, these open cases are just full of opportunities to be furthered. And even in some of the cases that I work on, you might just move it forward for the next detective. Maybe you're not the one that resolves it, but you just try to do what you can do to move it forward for the next person who's going to be in that same role.
Yeah. It kind of becomes a living document or a living case. I like that. And I like the way you talked about them being open, because I know even back in the day, we had a status called pended, which wasn't cleared. It wasn't a UCR clearance. And it was actually, we would debate that. We would debate it because it felt awkward to use the word penned, because that gave the idea that it was going to go on a shelf. I think that's how much most of us care, is that felt very awkward even to say we're pending this case for more investigation or more new information. But I think that's the best way to look at it, is they become living documents, or they should become living documents with a lot of effort that goes into them.
Absolutely.
So you have the happy face killer that you all are fairly confident that has killed Miss Skipple. At the time, you didn't know who she was. What transpired to give her a name? How did she become Patricia or Patsy? Was it family came forward? Was it DNA? How did that come to be?
Yeah, so we were just talking about how sometimes a case that, was looked at back in, say, 1993 versus 2022 has different investigative options. And this was a case that when we were reviewing it, I determined that it would be a good candidate for forensic genetic genealogy. And a lot of people are given this opportunity now to use this new DNA option to help to identify who their victims are, their Jane Does and their John Does, and in our case, Blue Pacheco.
Well, tell us more about this new technology, this new field of study, because I think it's fascinating from somebody that is an old man, and back in the day, mitochondrial DNA was kind of like a future thing. But Tell us about this. And then more specifically, do you have to get specific training and whatnot to be able to work in that world?
Some people do obtain specific training. A lot of law enforcement agencies will utilize forensic genetic genealogy services through a third party. For myself, when I started getting interested in forensic genetic genealogy, I decided to start pursuing a graduate certificate in that at New Haven University in Connecticut. The director of the program out there is Dr. Claire Glynn, and I would really recommend it for people in law enforcement who really want to take their genealogy pursuits further, and for civilians too, who are really interested in genealogy. But that is kind of the newer cutting edge program for this that exists currently. Basically, DNA in this sense is kind of used for us to just understand what our connections are between people. And when you look at the tool, in cases, sometimes you'll have a certain profile where you'll have a match right away, quickly, a very close connection. And sometimes when you use this tool, you don't. Basically, when you're using this tool, you use something to kind of compare what these relationships and connections are between people. That's called Centimorgan. And really, a centimorgan is a measure of kind of genetic linkages. And basically, the number of centimorgans that I share with another person helps me identify what my relationship is to that person. So, for example, you might share 3,500 centimorgans with your parent or your child. And with a sixth cousin, you might share 21. Our hope when we started looking at this case with our blue Pacheco was that we would hopefully develop a closer connection with someone that we would hopefully be able to determine was a close family relationship. But that is not what happened in this case. In this case, it ended up being a very far removed connection, kind of in about the fourth or fifth cousin range. So pretty far connection from who we were trying to identify. And I know a lot of people get kind of confused. Well, how does this work? Like, how does law enforcement do that? Like, how exactly is this process happening? Basically, a lot of people that do genealogy tests for themselves want to know more about maybe their family or maybe their heritage or maybe they're adoptees and they want to try to find family connection of a parent or sibling. They buy, a commercial kit from Family Tree DNA, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, MyHeritage, that sort of thing. But those platforms let you look at your connections predominantly with other users within that same platform. So separate from that, there is a hub called Ged Match. And Ged Match allows users to kind of upload their DNA data from Ancestry.com or 23andMe or whatever commercial test you took so that you can kind of see other connections with people who use different companies than yourself. As a user, when you do that, there's an option for you to opt in to help law enforcement, their investigations to identify, like in this case, a Jane Doe. That is what we did. So we decided that we were going to try to pursue forensic genetic genealogy to try to identify our blue Pacheco. I did not do this pursuit on my own. There are several commercial companies that do investigative forensic genetic genealogy, and I decided with my organization to partner with the DNA Doe Project. So I could tell you a little bit about the DNA Doe Project too, if you'd like.
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly.
Okay, so the DNA Doe Project, it's a nonprofit organization. They are predominantly focused on only identifying Jane and John Does, human remains cases. For me, when I was considering who would be a great fit for this case, thought that this case might be difficult, and I wanted to partner with somebody that I knew would continue to investigate the case even if it got very difficult. that is exactly what happened in this case. There was a lot of endogamy involved in this, which means essentially if you go back generations and generations and generations, there's a lot of people who kind of share those same connections and linkages because they're coming from smaller, say, towns and villages and areas. This case ended up being very difficult. Karen Binder and Harmony were the two people from the DNA Doe Project who I worked most closely with. They were phenomenal to work with on this case.
So again, they just do human remains, correct? It is unidentified human remains is their whole focus.
That's correct. That's their whole focus. And like I said, they're a nonprofit. So it's great because they get some wonderful funding for that. I will mention Harmony's last name because I didn't say it before, but it's Harmony Bronson. And the two of them and I started in 2019 together pursuing this. And it was really a back and forth between us of I needed to do my job in order for them to continue their research and helping to identify next likely targets. And the same is true with me. I needed them to pursue their research in order for me to identify the next contacts and forge through that. And so what that looked like sometimes, and most of the time since 2019 all the way through 2021, was me calling people out of the blue and over the phone, explaining to them who I was and what I was doing, and also explaining that I could only give them very minimal, limited details, and asking them if they would either participate in taking a test if I sent them a test for free, and then asking them after they took the test to upload it into Ged Match, or inquiring if they had already taken a test and asking them to upload it into Ged Match and opt into law enforcement being able to use it. It's a really tedious process on this case because, like I said, our initial connection was pretty far removed from who our Blue Pacheco was.
And it's an investigation inside investigation. I think when you get to those specialties, a lot of people that aren't around it don't understand that it becomes it has a breath and a heartbeat of its own.
Yeah, I would say it's great because ultimately, like, I work for a larger agency, but there's a lot of smaller agencies that just don't have funding for these types of cases. So it's an excellent opportunity for smaller agencies who want to pursue something to identify the unknown human remains and can have it either partially or fully funded by them if needed.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is neat is that while people are doing that natural curiosity, right, about where they come from or where their family is that there's an option to participate with law enforcement investigations, which is kind of neat because you're actually maybe going to have a shot at answering some questions for somebody that need to be answered. So that's pretty special in and of itself.
I agree. I think it's really, for law enforcement, it's really tough because initially Ged Match used to opt in all the users automatically. And then there was kind of a privacy concern that was expressed and they did the reverse. They made it so that you had to opt in on your own accord. And a lot of people just don't know that that's an option. And I think right now Ged Match probably has about 1.4 million users, but that does not mean that they're all opted into law enforcement. But then you look at something like Ancestry.com, who has several millions of users, and you just imagine if we could access that, that'd be amazing. I think a lot of people who use it don't even know that that's a possibility. I think there's a lot of people who use these commercial kits for their own, reasons, whether it's through Ancestry or Family Tree DNA or 23andMe and MyHeritage, and they don't even know that there's an option to upload their data into Ged Match to help law enforcement. And if everybody did that, that would help to identify these people who we have no idea who they are for their families. Yeah, that's something that it's a pretty incredible thing that's available for us to use now.
Pretty commendable of people that would be willing to do that. So maybe listening to this show, we'll get the awareness up on that a little bit.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
So back to Patsy, Was she, I'm
Yeah.
assuming, just buried as a Jane Doe and was then exhumed? Or how did this match up?
You mean when she was initially found?
Yeah,
Or do
was
you
she-
mean
yes.
how?
When she was initially found,
When she was-
yes.
Okay. Yeah, of course. When Patricia was initially found, she was not buried. I will say that she was just dumped on the side of the roadway. And at the time, detectives from the past and then over time were able to preserve some good DNA samples for being able to pursue genealogy.
That's what I was going to talk about too, is that you may not have access to exactly where the samples came from, but just the idea that there was usable DNA from something that old, that's pretty special itself. Pretty special itself.
When Patricia was found on the side of the road, she would have been 44 or 45 years old. I can't make a definitive determination about that because on the day that she was found, it was very close to her birthday. I can't discuss with definitive certainty if she was 44 or 45, but she was either 44 or 45. So she was a young lady, very young.
So at what point in the investigation, I guess after she was identified, was family contacted, or was it difficult finding relatives?
When we're doing these forensic genetic genealogy investigations, and when I was talking about how we would call people out of the blue and ask for them if they would consider helping us by either testing or uploading their data to Ged Match if they had already tested, we know as investigators, as we're getting closer and closer to our target, that eventually we will likely come across or possibly come across somebody who may know our victim. In this case, that's essentially what happened.
Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police Podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police Podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.